see.
As soon as it quiets down a little bit, you can just start speaking and your microphone will...
Okay, good morning, everybody. Even those of you who are very tired will probably be observant enough to notice that I'm not Constanze, who was originally in the program. So I'm a late substitute and a late stand-in for her, because I believe she's lost her voice. So I'm Gordon Carrera, and I'll be moderating this morning's excellent panel, which is a chance to really deep dive into the situation in Ukraine, how we got here, what's happening now, and crucially, what's happening next, and a view from informed commentators and leading officials here in Europe, as well as people with experience of the United States. From military aid to troops on the ground, Ukraine is a steel porcupine is our title. Excellent panel here. Next to me, speaking first, will be Kristen and Michal, the Prime Minister of Estonia. We have Torrey Taussig, a former senior official at the Pentagon and the NSC, then and now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Georgina Wright, special advisor at the German Marshall Fund, and Michael Kofman at the end from the Carnegie Endowment and a leading military expert. So we have a great panel to be able to look at some of the questions that come up from Ukraine, which is a subject which has obviously been there throughout this conference and it's been at the heart of it. But I think some of those questions about where we go next are what I think we will end up focusing on this panel, and what the real options are with relationship to what the military challenges are. What could, for instance, a coalition of the willing really look like? What could it do? What are the options in that? And how should we contribute or think about approaching some of those challenges? So I'm going to start by asking the Prime Minister to go first and make a few remarks. Prime Minister, give us a sense of how you from Estonia here view the importance, if you like, of making Ukraine that steel porcupine.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning to everybody. Good morning to our presidents. I can see both former president and previous president, not previous, but president right now, Carnegie is here, so it's a great honor. Sorry. My bad. Okay, but with the topic, it says that I was looking at the wiki before, and I know it's not probably the best source every day, but it says that porcupines are solitary, slow-moving animals that largely keep to themselves unless threatened. So that probably gives the topic also that with Ukraine, with any state, that if they're not threatened, not poked at, they will keep to themselves. But the problem is with Russia, and I have a few remarks about it. That first, the most important is that if we look at the Ukraine, I would say that Ukraine is defending our future, Europe's future. Rule-based word, like in a sense that it used to be, rule-based word, not even deal-based word, rule-based word, value-based word. Supporting Ukraine is self-defense. That is probably the first point I'd like to make. Second, that Ukraine absolutely has our back. We were 2 days ago in Tirana, Albania, where everybody probably, or most of European leaders and wider European community leaders told also President Zelensky that we are absolutely 100% behind Ukraine. President Zelensky had arrived just from Turkey, and as everybody knows that he was there, not afraid, willing to talk, but President Putin was missing. Nobody knows where. Not even the doubles were there. So that's quite obvious that problem is with Putin and Russia, and they probably feel the pressure coming on them, and they feel like also their allies fear that Russia is giving up or losing in this pressure. Because I would say that during a couple of weeks something has happened which has happened never before, or let's say has not happened before Oslo meeting and so on, because President Trump and the States said that they are pressuring Russia with partners from Europe. They see Europe as a partner of pressuring Russia, which is kind of alternation in state of mind. I would say that is very important. But the problem still is Putin, and I would say that President Zelensky, Ukraine, have acted very wisely. They have showed openness to any talks of ceasefire and just a lasting peace. So I would say that right now, if anybody knows where Putin is, let us know, but the whole world is waiting for him. And the third point probably is that even though there's like a feeling that soon there will be some kind of ceasefire or peace or just a lasting peace, hopefully, the aid to Ukraine must continue. The pressure on Russia is the first thing, and second thing is aid to Ukraine. Because if you would get soft, say that everything has happened already, then probably we will lose something on the way on the talks. So these are the things. And 3 points on the road ahead also that I would mention with everything obvious already, that probably Russia's demands and what they want are some kind of demilitarized Ukraine to demobilize the army, which we cannot let happen. That probably is the first line of defense in Europe and Ukraine. Strong Ukrainian army, well equipped, well trained, and not in small numbers. Second is that Russia must not have any saying in EU and NATO matters. Our region, our associations, we decide, not they. Because this is quite important in months and years to come, that the only thing Russia must be allowed to decide how soon will they withdraw the troops. Nothing else, not in this region, because this is quite important. And third, which is quite important also in years to come, that Russia must be the one who pays the bill, and not our taxpayers. That is universally understandable in any country, because to be honest, if they don't feel the consequences what they are doing, if they are not responsible for that, they will continue it. So these are my opening remarks. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Torrey, can I come to you next? This issue of the steel Porcupine there, I wonder how much that was, you were inside the administration, in previous years, how much that was how it was being thought of as a strategy. I mean, obviously one of the questions that Ukrainians, or the criticisms Ukrainians raise about the US policy, was that they were being given enough support to not lose but not to win. I just wonder if you could kind of give us a sense of whether you think that there's been a thought-through strategy about that level of defense that needs to be provided.
Well, first, thank you very much to the organizers for this invitation, and it's a privilege to be on such an esteemed panel, especially with the Prime Minister this morning. It's always a little dangerous to play Monday morning quarterback, and I want to distill any notions that I was a Senate-confirmed official with real decision-making authority during the last administration. But I did work on this issue for 3 years, and so I'll do my best to outline how I think we've arrived at this moment and what the overarching strategy and objectives were. I mean, look, I think first and foremost, the U.S. position on this war has been to provide Ukraine with as much defense to achieve its own future and remain sovereign and independent in doing so. That in itself delivers a strategic defeat to Russia. Of course, we all know what Russia's longer-term imperial ambitions are over Ukraine and Europe more broadly. Second has been to enact significant military and economic costs on Russia to show that Russia's long-term aims in Ukraine will not be successful. But that's balanced by 2 additional objectives, which were to maintain unity within the NATO alliance and between US and its allies more broadly, and avoid a broader confrontation between NATO and Russia. Now, I know many of us could look at paradoxes within that overarching strategy, but I do think the objectives that were outlined did leave this administration in a place that could point to many successes in terms of where we are today. Now, I would push back on what we hear from officials today, saying that the choice was always between endless conflict and peace. Of course, we all want the killing to end. But I think that's a false choice. I think the choice has always been and remains today putting Ukraine in the best position to negotiate its own future with Russia or securing a false peace that concedes to Putin's demands. I still think that's the choice that we faced then, and that is the choice we'd face today. I would say another core tenet of the last 3 years of Ukraine's strategy have been nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Questions of Ukraine's territorial integrity would always be Kyiv's and Kyiv's alone. And I think this was an overarching worldview of the Biden administration, that we are stronger and more effective when we work alongside our allies and partners in achieving not only Ukraine's future success, but in anything we chose to do in the world. And I was very proud of the near monthly meetings over 3 years that Secretary Austin hosted with over a coalition of over 50 countries from around the world. I don't think any country could have done that other than the United States, and I think it put Ukraine in a far better position today than had we all acted independently. So I'll pause there.
Okay. We'll come back to some of the detail of that. Michal, I wonder if you could give us a bit of a view from the ground at the moment. You're a regular visitor to Ukraine, about the military situation, and particularly how that might play into the questions of whether there is pressure on either side to actually move to the table, or whether they are still seeing the ability to extract their goals through military purposes, particularly the Russians, obviously.
Thanks, happy to. And good to be back in Estonia. I think we have a committed audience, looking at how many people have shown up on a Sunday morning panel.
Yeah.
A captive audience.
Yeah. So I think the bottom line is the situation as I see it is difficult, but it's far less fragile than what it was looking late last year. I think the truth is that it's actually better, quite better than expected. And if you look at the current situation, although the intensity of Russian offensive efforts is picking up, probably since around the last week of March, the front is holding, and there's no sign of any kind of imminent collapse of the front lines. And I think from that point of view, the Ukrainian position is actually firmly rooted in the battlefield situation, right? The position they've taken towards ceasefire negotiation. There is at times this perception that there's some kind of imminent danger, but the reality is, if you sort of visit the front lines and you see the current situation, it's too early to say it's stable, but it's also not nearly that bad. Let me give maybe a brief recap. So if you look at kind of the arc of the conflict last year, the Russian military, the way it had been fighting, it'd been clear that they didn't have the force quality, it didn't have the enablers to try to achieve operationally significant breakthroughs. So they spent much of last year trying to press their way to the front. This was very, very casualty intensive on their end, but they were starting to pick up speed and make gains over the course of summer and fall. The Ukrainian military then began to effectively adapt to the Russian approach. My colleague and longtime friend Jack Watling talked a bit about it yesterday on his panel. And that adaptation was meant to counter how Russian forces were fighting, and also to adjust for the fact that Ukraine was having some of its own force generation issues, to try to find a more efficient way of fighting that was less manpower intensive against an adversary that had very significant manpower advantage. I mean, I think it's obvious to all of us, but to understand, if you're in a protracted war with a country like Russia, one of their key advantages will be not necessarily material, but for sure manpower. Okay, that then began to demonstrate some success, and the Russian offensive momentum stalled over the course of the winter. It's picked back up some now that we go into the spring, right? So what can we expect? I do think it's too soon to say that the front is stabilized, but overall, you see that across the kind of operational axes where the Russian military is attacking, most of the pressure now is in the same places, in Donetsk. I think that you've seen the offensive effort pick up, particularly in the last couple of weeks. And there's talk of a summer offensive, but the reality is we are probably not going to see a discrete Russian offensive on some separate axis. What you're very likely seeing already is a soft launch of that offensive effort, and you're going to see simply an increased intensification and more Russian units being thrown into the fight in the same place that you're currently seeing them. And then, of course, the big question is we'll have to see how the fighting, how the situation unfolds over the course of June, July, August. The last point on this, if you look in terms of munitions, capabilities, and other things provided to Ukraine, Ukraine is not at risk of running out of most key capabilities anytime soon, or at least not on a very short-term timeline. And at this point of the war, Ukraine does make a lot of what it needs for day-to-day battlefield needs. If much of the attrition, the way they are fighting, essentially treating Russian forces to effective employment of minefields, drones, and traditional fires, but big emphasis on the drone side of the equation, you'll see that Ukraine actually makes now most of the capabilities that it needs, provided there's sufficient financial support and investment from Western countries. And yes, in some areas it is still very much dependent on the West, but much less so if we went to earlier phase of the war, where asymmetry in artillery fire or artillery ammunition might have been much more critical to the course of the fighting.
Thank you, Michael. Georgina, can I come to you about the diplomatic side, and particularly a view from the UK and maybe France as well, about how you think they perceive the need for them to take the lead at this point? There's been a lot from Macron and Starmer positioning themselves, and they've been out and obviously talking about potentially even providing troops. How serious is the thinking behind that, do you think? And how likely is it to happen?
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you to the organisers. It's great to be here. I always say there's nothing, nothing has brought Paris and London closer together than the Ukraine war. A lot of people think, it was the end of Brexit negotiations. No, it was the Ukraine war that brought Paris and London closer together. And you're seeing a level of intensified cooperation, which we haven't seen in a very, very long time. Why they're taking on this sort of lead, particularly in the thinking of the coalition of the willing in case of a ceasefire, is, primarily driven because they are the two largest European armies, the two European nuclear powers, but also because of what the Donald Trump administration is saying, which is it wants to play a reduced role in European security, and it's not prepared to provide any form of backstop or troops on the ground in case of ceasefire. So it is both by conviction because a secure Ukraine is good for Euro-Atlantic security, and by necessity, which is, without the United States, the two biggest and largest armies have to provide some form of option with other countries joining in. So they are really spearheading this thought process, and we've seen a number of summits, a number of talks, a number of visits to Ukraine, and I wouldn't read the sort of lack of information around the coalition of willing as necessarily talk stalling. There are just a number of logistical and political obstacles and gaps that need to be bridged. So when we think about the coalition of the willing, it really started with the fact that the United States has ruled out any NATO-led force in case of a ceasefire. And, when we hear about what a coalition of the willing would look like, we know that it's a number of forces, whether it's between 20,000 troops to 100,000 troops, situated 200 to 300 kilometers away from the border. And from London's perspective, very much not replacing the Ukrainian army, but acting as a buffer to deter further Russian aggression. But I guess there are three key questions that remain. One is, how much can we credibly do without the United States? And I think from London's perspective, obviously there are capabilities and a number of military assistance that the United States provides that we at the moment cannot fully match up, but it's also about intelligence. And I think for London, there's a sense that if the United States is not going to do anything in terms of providing a backstop, it needs to say so clearly so that we can prepare our publics for what that entails for the purse, but also for long-term commitment. The second question is on capability and resources. If you commit troops to Ukraine, does that create vulnerabilities on NATO's eastern flank? And I think Paris is more confident that you can do both. I think London is slightly more worried about that. And that's the reason why we're trying, London and Paris are really trying to convene a broad coalition of countries to bring as many people on board. And then you cannot talk about the coalition of the willing without maintaining sanctions on Russia and rebuilding Ukraine. And so there will be more conferences on what we can do now to rebuild Ukraine, because a stronger Ukraine, not only on the battlefield, but also in terms of infrastructure, will make it easier for a coalition of the willing to be deployed. And then I think the third question is the long-term commitment. Keir Starmer, President Macron, they would be taking a generational pledge to be, present in Ukraine, to deter Russian aggression. And there's, questions about will all coalition partners remain in it for the long haul? And, sometimes in London you hear 2027, big presidential election in France. We don't know who's going to get the keys to the Élysée Palace. If it's Le Rassemblement National, will they continue to support Ukraine in that way? And I think I'm mildly encouraged for two reasons. One, the Rassemblement National is quite anti-American, so anything that could be seen as European is actually probably a good thing. And second, we've seen visits of Rassemblement National deputies to the Baltic countries, taking a significant interest in what's happening in Ukraine, and really seeing this as not only about Ukraine, but about broader European security. But there are concerns about how European politics are changing and what this means for long-term commitment to Ukraine.
Thank you, Georgina. Prime Minister, can I come back to you on this question of what Europe can do for the long-term security? I mean, we've got the NATO summit coming up. What kind of language, what kind of direction does Europe need to be showing in terms of Ukraine's future relationship with both NATO and the EU, and how important is that?
I would say it's utmost importance, because if you remain consistent on your messages and action, that probably will help everybody concerning Europe's future, also Ukraine's future, because as I already mentioned that I strongly believe, and everybody probably in Europe does, as already mentioned, that if we keep Ukrainian army strong, that is the first line of defense. So this should also be included in our military capability plans as possible. But also defense expenditure must rise. I would say that Estonia last year was in top 3 in NATO, and next year probably still will be there. I don't know in which position, but our defense expenditure will be quite high, over 5% of our GDP, which is not easy, to be honest. It's even we have to raise taxes, and you can probably imagine that is not very popular right now, but we have to do it. So I would say that if Europe steps up and understands that even though there could be some kind of peace, I hope it will be just peace, lasting peace, not, as already mentioned, bad deal or whatever it's called, like Putin's terms, peace. Also, Europe must continue on its path to rearm. That means that you have capabilities, I would say, in defense industry. If something has taught us the Ukrainian conflict, that in the times of need, you have the need to produce everything on the site as soon as possible. Innovation, invention, everything should be done there. So Ukraine is showing that. And with defense expenditure, I would say that yes, they have to go on, and the support to Ukraine has to go on. But even though in Europe, everybody has already mentioned that Europe is not one state, not one country. Everybody has the differences. Right now, today, as we are here, outside is beautiful, and we are sitting inside in Estonia, as it's customary. We have the elections going on in Romania. So I would say that at the evening, that probably will be the first news that we are looking at, or tomorrow, what will happen with that. So Europe will never be everybody on the same foot or same page, but even though there are differences, I would say the direction must continue being consistent. We are building up and ramping up our capabilities in defense. If we want to have the freedoms and we want to have the wealth, which Europe has, so I would say that security and prosperity, they are like brothers, they go together, not one without another. So with the state's message and Trump message right now, I would say that if the message is understood, and Estonia it is, then if Europe keeps consistent, and most of Europe keeps consistent, and NATO members, then I would say we are on the right path for bad reasons. But we are on the right path. And with Ukraine also, that, as already mentioned, that we should assess and include, that has been also the talk in European Council on the state leaders level, that how do we assess what will be our contribution, national, everybody, to keep up the Ukraine's army, to have this kind of capabilities that they need to keep this strong, because this is the first line of defense. Our missions there will be for, let's say, deterrence and peacekeeping. But the first line is Ukraine's army, strong army. Not a weak army, not a small army, as Putin wants.
But I think one of the challenges will be making sure Europe is united behind Ukraine's army, which may become a politically more of a challenge with some of the countries.
To be honest, I probably won't see a day that Europe is 100% united.
Yeah.
But right now, I would say, even though, as already mentioned, with the bad reasons, but Europe is much stronger than it was 6 months ago or 1 year ago. That it started with a triangle, London, Paris, Brussels. Right now, it's added Berlin. I would say that if I look at the picture and with the European wider political community we had in Albania, Tirana 2 days ago, I would say that if I look at the European Commission, if I look at the Merz, Emmanuel, Keir Starmer, I would say that they are on the same foot. Zelensky is sitting behind the table. So I would say that the core of Europe is coming together right now. For bad reasons, but good things are happening. And Europe is much stronger than it was right now. And not only in the European Union, it's wider. We have countries not in the European Union that are big supporters of Ukraine. So will be never on the same foot in all the countries in Europe. Let's not hope for that, but let's hope that the countries that matter and values that matter are kept in the core and it's strong.
Torrey, you want to come in there?
Sorry, I was just going to add a follow-up point on Ukraine's future with NATO, because I think this is a really important point to keep in mind. If we look over the last few years, NATO has been kept somewhat at an arm's length, perhaps intentionally by the United States, in coordinating security assistance for Ukraine because of that concern of a broader NATO-Russia conflict. But Ukraine's future in NATO is seminal for, I would say, 3 reasons. One is to deny Putin his longer-term objective of keeping Ukraine in a gray zone and determining Ukraine's future for itself. That remains fundamental. NATO's open door policy has to remain true, and we need that not just for Ukraine, but for the broader future of this order. 2, as has been discussed many times this weekend, Ukraine has a tremendous amount to offer European security. It is the largest army on the European continent. It is the most battle-tested on the European continent. And moving forward in how Europe looks to defend itself, I think Ukraine in the longer term will play a seminal part of that. And that will also be through NATO. And 3, quietly I shouldn't even say quietly, but over the last number of years and even over the last decade, NATO and Ukraine have made tremendous strides in interoperability and political cohesion. And we've seen that through the creation of the NATO-Ukraine Council, in which NATO and Ukraine now sit together as equals. We've seen this in 2023 and 2024 with the creation of the JTEC, the Joint Analysis, Training and Education Center, where the alliance is learning timely lessons learned from Ukraine on how to address a Russian army. In 2024, we created the NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine, which does a better job at helping coordinate training and assistance for Ukraine and having a NATO role in that. But that is real institutional interoperability between this alliance and Ukraine. That would be lamentable if we reverse that. But it did, and this gets to the last point of what we attempted to do last year, which was ensure that Ukraine's path toward NATO is not just forward-looking, but also irreversible. And that's fundamental for the other 2 reasons that I mentioned.
Michal, this issue of the coalition of the willing and putting troops, France and Britain have talked about this. It's a little vague at the moment, and what that actually means. And obviously it's going to depend on if there's a ceasefire, what kind of deal. Very different things those troops could be doing, aren't there? And is it clear to you what the range of possibilities are, and crucially, how realistic it is without US assistance?
So as far as I understand it, there are several debates out there right now on whether it will have a ground force component or primarily be a deployment of European air power and maybe naval power of those countries that are already littoral states in the Black Sea. And that would make a crucial difference. But it's also a good question to ask if this is a force that's going to come in as part of a ceasefire agreement, if this is a force that's going to be coming in after a ceasefire agreement is going to be made, or let's say there is no ceasefire agreement, right? For example, it's quite likely that in the near term there won't be one. If there is some reduced intensity in the conflict, when there's a deployment by a coalition of states nonetheless, or at least a phased beginning of deployment of some kind, like Sky Shield or whatnot, things that folks have been arguing for. The first question is it possible, is it feasible? Yes, it is. I wrote about the subject with Jack a couple months ago, basically looking at the requirements. It would involve trade-offs on current regional defense plans, and it would be a bit of a stretch. But yes, I think it is possible for something about the size of a multinational division on rotation. Second, let's be very honest. If collectively European states cannot deploy something to the effect of a multinational division in Ukraine, then there are much bigger questions to be asked. And the panel yesterday asked them. On paper, Europe has a lot of capacity, but Excel spreadsheets don't fight. One of the biggest challenges is that Europe lacks the capacity to independently conduct large-scale combat operations. This would not even be anything close to that requirement. A multinational division is well within the means of certain states to do. Secondarily, if you look at what this force might be doing in Ukraine, this force would not be taking over the principal deterrence and defense mission of Ukrainian units on the front line. It is not meant to do that. That's not what the argument is for. But it is also not a peacekeeping force or a training only in Western Ukraine force. Such a force is not useful to Ukraine, okay? Nor would be particularly representative of Western commitment, nor would serve as a serious deterrent. This force ideally would be in Ukraine. It would ideally have components of it somewhere near key operational directions, and it could then serve as an anchor for any NATO air power that is supporting from NATO member states' territory to tie it together. Yes, all of this would be complex. Some of it would be a stretch, and some of it might involve U.S. support and organization. On the backstop, this is a bit of a political issue. Some states are clearly much more willing to go without a U.S. backstop, like France. Other countries keep asking for one, even though the situation, even though the situation might be better left ambiguous. Sometimes folks say that it's best not to ask if you know that the immediate answer is no. So this is just my own view. It is to some extent disappointing that a backstop is required for a number of European states even to consider such a deployment, okay? And that this is required to help bring countries on board. Because from my point of view, at least this year, Europe faces a number of choices, but one of the biggest choices they face about the future of European security is what are they going to do to support the Ukrainian military and make sure it stays in the field in the event there is a ceasefire or some type of armistice. Because this is a choice between one of two futures. Yes, many European countries, NATO members, can focus on their own defense and rearmament. However, Russian military reconstitution is not an if, it is a when. And the timelines we typically debate are really narcissism of small differences. Because even 10 years in defense planning is typically the shortest timeline we operate on, okay? So then the question is the Ukrainian military going to be kept in the field? Is Russia going to have to deal with Ukraine as a contingency? Ideally, something more as a porcupine. Porcupine is a good analogy, but the requirements of operational strike, and at least the way the Ukrainian military has been fighting, and even the way you heard the Estonian chief of defense speak yesterday, the way he wants to fight, are something much closer to like a badger or a wolverine, if we're going to use bad animal analogies, okay? As he explained, it's very hard to win a war with just defense. And a lot of the investments are actually have to do with offense, at least at operational depths. So with that being kept in mind, yeah, Europe does have to make a choice. Is it going to make a commitment in order to make sure that the Ukrainian army isn't demobilized, doesn't have to fade from the field under an armistice, that there is a true deterrent, and then Ukrainians have hope that there's a security commitment. They don't leave the country, there is investment. This is one of the biggest questions. What does Ukraine look like after this? Okay? Or are they going to try to do the most bare minimum of effort and maybe try to have it both ways, right? Have some kind of maybe air component deploy, no real ground forces, even though they have that capacity, and focus on their own rearmament. I clearly have a preference, and you can tell what that is by the way I'm discussing, but it is a choice about the future of European security.
And Georgina, I mean, when it comes to the kind of politics of this within these countries, it's not easy, is it? Because we saw Britain and France particularly stand up very quickly to offer to take a leading role in this, and you could see why. It was about keeping the US on board and showing the Trump administration that they could stand up and Europe was able to play a role. But I think once then some of the thoughts about what it actually meant started coming out, you could see even in Britain some of the politics getting, you know, people asking hard questions about what would happen if the Russians try and push against this, or try and, you know, to disrupt this. And, you know, there's lots of opportunities for Russia if, for instance, there's British troops on the ground to try and, you know, to really kind of drive a wedge between allies. So I mean, is your sense that there is still a kind of understanding and commitment to this kind of process from allies?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, because I can understand the ambiguity side, that you don't want to make certain things, you don't want to sort of be very transparent about what you're prepared to do and not prepared to do. But at the same time, you have to prepare your publics for something that might be a multi-generational commitment. And that is the straddle that, there's a politician, prime minister on the panel, he will know this better than anyone about how you do that. And I think timing is an issue. I think for London, trying to demonstrate to the United States that Europeans were serious about doing something was very important. France is more sort of, we can do this without the United States. I mean, ideally it would, again, for intelligence and capabilities in the short term, it would be great to cooperate, but we need to plan as if we can't rely on Washington for this. But Michael, you made a really important point on timing, because when we talk about coalitions of the willing, I think it's how quickly we could deploy it and how credibly we could deploy it. Because you're right, do we deploy before there's some form of a ceasefire, immediately on the day there's a ceasefire, or later down the line? And I was in Moscow before COVID for this exchange, and I remember we asked a prominent Russian, what is the one thing that the West underestimates about Russia and Russia underestimates about the West? And he paused, and then he said, the West underestimates Russia's ability to invade Ukraine, and Russia underestimates Ukraine's ability to fight back. 2019, right? He said this, and I think in a way the Russians thought that Europeans weren't going to support Ukraine like they did for as long as they did. And it's the same now with this coalition of the willing. In Russia, there is a sense that this is all talk, but actually when push comes to shove and Washington's not there, it's not going to be credible and it's not going to be quickly deployed. And you can imagine a scenario where we take time to station those troops, and then, Russia starts striking deals. Like, there are some countries in Europe that think, oh, well, there's a ceasefire, it's the end of the war, it would be quite nice to get some gas again and cheaper, energy bills. You can imagine all of that happening. And I think that's why, in the broader sense of politics, Paris and London say this is not just a question of troops, it's about maintaining sanctions on Russia. It's about ensuring that Russia can't use this space to, get a favourable kind of new diplomatic rapprochement with certain European countries and start making that coalition of the willing much more feeble, and that it doesn't work. So the politics are important to prepare your publics. It's important to maintain some strategic ambiguity, but it's also important to make sure that you're there immediately when there is a ceasefire, but there are complications with that as well.
I'm going to come to questions from the audience in a minute. Prime Minister, I mean, the importance of a long-term commitment and preparing the public for a long-term commitment. I mean, that is a challenge, isn't it? Because we've heard Russian negotiators supposedly in the last few days talk about, well, if it takes 21 years, like some of our historic wars, for us to do this, we're going to do this. I mean, that is going to be a challenge for Europe to sustain that for the long term, to sustain public support in the long term. I mean, we heard Georgina mention as well, there may be challenges if we're putting in a force into Ukraine in protecting the eastern flank, and that could have implications even for Estonia and things like British troop presence here in Estonia, which I know Estonia considers very important. So that, there could be trade-offs and tough trade-offs here, and a need to bring the public along in the long term.
Yeah, but I would ask the question is absolutely important, and I would ask that, but to what it is that to commit with Europe if not to the peace? And peace in Europe is peace in Ukraine. Just a long-lasting peace is peace also for Europe. Pressure on Russia. People in Estonia have been saying in Europe also that Europe is project for peace. But to what we will commit if not to the peace? The economy, to having, as mentioned, cheap gas from Russia or what? So I would say that this is the only option, to be honest. And this probably has also been told to public that if we want to have a peace in Europe, we should also commit to it. And that also means that the commitment means probably backing up Ukraine's army if needed. With different capabilities, funding, also in training and so on. So Estonia has already publicly said that from the government side, because in Estonia it's parliament's mandate to make these kind of decisions, but if there is, with our allies, France, UK, led mission there, that we will be part of it. That's quite obvious. And yes, probably it will have, as you said, this kind of trade-off that even though you would like to build, I don't know, whatever, you would like to build roads or you would like to build different kind of buildings everywhere, all over the countries. But if you have the choice to have a peace and keep that and keep Russia in its borders, and the only thing they understand is force and unity, so nothing else. I have seen many people in this kind of position that thinking that with Russia and with bullies you will start giving and it will end. No, it won't. If you start giving, you will be giving up. It will happen. Absolutely. At first you give something, then you give your dignity, then your freedom. That will happen, absolutely. So I would say this question, the answer is quite obvious. To what there is to commit with Europe, with all the countries of Europe, if not to the peace. This is the Europe's core. Simple. Yeah.
Torrey, I wonder, it's hard for you, I wouldn't ask you to try and predict what the Trump administration would do. I think that's hard. But you know, there's a kind of a level of political theatre in which it's no backstop, Europe must do it all itself. But how much space is there beneath that for the US to continue to offer support, if you like, less in the spotlight for that kind of mission in Ukraine and for European security, do you think?
Look, I mean, as you said, it's very hard to predict where this administration will go in 6 months, let alone this afternoon. But I do think that President Trump likes to be a part of winning solutions. And there is a very small window of opportunity in which the Europeans present the administration with some sort of winning, credible solution for bringing an end to this fighting, also helping bring Ukraine to the negotiating table as a part of reassuring its own future, and presents the United States with an option of a credible reassurance force that it can be a part of, that presents this winning solution. Again, I think that the window for that is small, given long-standing inclinations that this president has toward Russia and toward Ukraine, but I think Europeans can only continue to make the case that this is the best way for the fighting to end and to assure Ukraine's future moving forward. I did just want to make one point on the timing of this ceasefire force and development of capabilities moving forward. This is a concern I have. I don't have an answer to this, but you know, we're looking ahead to a NATO summit in less than 6 weeks, almost we're a month out, and we heard the Deputy Secretary General speak earlier about allies at the June Defense Ministerial agreeing to a new set of capability targets, which is important, and it is a good step for filling NATO's family of plans moving forward. But I really worry we're headed toward a summit in which these capability targets and these decisions about force posture are being made in a vacuum. First, because it's pretty clear at this summit we will not know what U.S. force posture in Europe will look like. That will take part of a global posture review that takes longer. I think we all know where it's going, but we don't know what that force posture will look like. And so NATO allies may end up having to fulfill 65, 70% of NATO targets, where that's not the picture now. Ukraine also will not likely be at this summit. And so these conversations about how the alliance moves forward with defense spending and capability development will not be discussed in the context of what the alliance is going to do for Ukraine moving forward. And there was, as Georgina mentioned, you know, there is this French sense of confidence that Europe can do both. It can defend itself and it can defend Ukraine. But this will come down to capabilities. And decisions about a ceasefire force and about capability targets for meeting Europe's own defenses are near-term decisions that need to be made, and we don't know what U.S. contributions to Europe will look like. And again, we'll be having these alliance discussions without Ukraine as a part of the overall atmosphere. And again, this is a concern. I don't have an answer, but it does feel like we are, and these next couple months, we're in this mismatch of discussing capabilities without the full picture of what we need to be providing to Ukraine and what the United States contributions will look like.
Georgina, did you want to come in there?
Very quickly, Gordon. I mean, I was really surprised in Washington because when you asked them, what's your problem with Europeans? So there's a bipartisan consensus that we're free riding, we haven't done enough, we hear this over and over again. But actually, I feel that the Trump administration's biggest problem with Europeans is you're just an annoyance, right? We have other priorities in the world. We want to bilateralize stuff with China. We've got Mexico that we want to deal with, a number of other things. And you're just an annoyance. You're taking up a lot of our energy and a lot of our time. J.D. Vance, the sort of sense that he sees daily ministers from Europe and ambassadors who come with a long shopping list saying, we know things need to change, but if you could maintain everything the same in my country. It's just a very bad strategy of engagement with Washington. I think if Europeans came to the NATO summit and said, look, we want stability in Europe, and that means stability, long-term stability in Ukraine, and you want stability in Europe to be able to do other things. And these are the three things that we need from you in the short to medium term, and these are all the other things that we're going to do. Now, there are lots of politicians and eminent people in the room. I always laugh when my dad says, but you're a researcher, it's very easy for you to say this. You don't have carry any responsibility for making those decisions. So there are lots of people in the room who know this better than I do, but it's very difficult to agree to three asks. But I think that is the most productive way to engage Washington. It doesn't feel like saying, but we're doing all this stuff, we're discussing all these things that we can do, is necessarily going to work. But if we said, stability is in your interests, this is how we achieve it, I think that would be a better call.
One last question for Michael before I go to the audience. On the issue of a ceasefire, I mean, from what you were saying about the military balance at the moment, is there any sense in which either of both sides perhaps think they can still achieve their goals militarily and therefore they don't need to come to the table? I mean, because it feels like from what you're saying, we're back at a kind of relative balance a balance, as opposed to one side having the upper hand and feeling the other side feeling that maybe they need to sue for peace. I mean, because that's a slightly different feel from where we were maybe a few months ago.
I don't think it's changed significantly. I think Russia's had the material advantage for quite some time, but it simply hasn't been decisive. So if you look at relative to their war aims and the objectives they're trying to achieve, it's just very hard for them to get there the way they're fighting, simply the way they're employing the forces, and how the military is underperforming given their material advantage. Unfortunately, where we are in the war, you don't see strong incentives, right? Certainly not for Russia to agree to a ceasefire, and even if they did, the likelihood that it's going to be a durable ceasefire, from my point of view, is very low. I think everybody understands that. Who knows? Maybe you believe that tomorrow there'll be a morning phone call with Putin and a significant breakthrough, and there'll be some kind of commitment. I am deeply skeptical of that. On the Ukrainian side, well, I think for Ukraine, that's certainly a big question of if they are able to play this out over the course of summer, withstand the increased intensity of Russian offensive effort, okay, and there's still sustained European support as we get into the fall, and they're not pressed to accept a deal with conditions that they consider to be unacceptable, okay, then they may stand in better position in the kind of terms they can expect, right? Ultimately, right now, they're not in a situation where they have to accept, quote unquote, a bad deal. The front is not collapsing, and so kind of the arbitrary pressure to meet a timeline for a deal doesn't really comport with the current situation at the front line. All right. Now that said, if you take kind of the art of the long view, let's be frank. I don't think the war is sustainable for either side. Okay, I think that's clear. It's not sustainable for Russia. If you look at economic and issues and other things that they're going to have, if you play it out to 2026, for Ukraine, much depends on external material support. Okay, and we're increasingly in an environment where I don't think there's going to be another supplemental in the United States that's not being asked for. And Ukraine very much is still going to depend on the stability of Western support for parts of this war effort. So there is a question of exhaustion, right?
Okay, time for questions. I have, I'll try and take them in groups. I have two here at the front. Actually, thank you. and then I'll move over to that side. Actually, if we could take these three, I have three in a row here, which makes it a bit easier. Say who you are, thank you, and if it's directed at anyone.
Heisburg, FRS in Paris, an unconfident Frenchman, I'm afraid. There's been a lot of talk about the confident French. My understanding of the situation from what I've heard on this panel this morning, what we've heard from Ambassador Whitaker, what we've heard more broadly is the following. We're not moving towards an unconditional long ceasefire, first item. Secondly, we're not going to have a meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council in The Hague, however much the Biden administration may have wanted it, but the Biden administration is no longer there. We are going to have a smaller US force presence in Europe. That certainly was the signal from Ambassador Whitaker. And since he was trying very hard to reassure us otherwise, I suspect he may actually have been more moderate than what the reality is going to be, which is going to hit us. So for the Europeans to expect to be able to have much influence on the course of events on the basis of a force which will be somewhat smaller than K4 or I4 was 25 years ago, which we're no longer able to do, by the way, I think it's not a great horse to ride. I can understand why we've been riding it. And I'm not criticizing Starmer or Macron on this one, but this is not the wave of the future. And if we're looking over the next 2 years, the best that we can do, I think, is to actually help the Porcupine. And that is replace the Americans money-wise and hopefully weapon-wise in the support of Ukraine. Sustainability. When I look at the Russian effort, you know what it reminds me of in the war? It reminds me of the French effort during the war in Algeria. 500,000 soldiers in Algeria, 6% of GDP for defense. The war in Algeria didn't stop because we ran out of soldiers or because we ran out of money. We stopped it because it was a stupid war. And I don't think there's anybody in Russia today who's able to make that stupid war has to stop decision. So I'm afraid that I don't agree with you, Michael. I suspect that the Russians can do this for much more long. Thank you.
Next to you, thank you.
James Shah, ICDS. First, if anyone has not read Michael Kofman's article with Jack Watling on the European Deterrence Force, it's a compelling article. I'd urge you to read it. Now, forgive me for changing focus, and my question is mainly to Michael Kofman, but not exclusively. Are we not in danger of ignoring Belarus and Russian deployments in Belarus and Russian planned deployments in Belarus, nuclear as well as conventional? There has been some public discussion of the threat that might be posed to Poland. There has been almost no public discussion about the possibility of Russia launching a fresh offensive in western Ukraine in the direction of Lviv, which of course would have the merit, amongst other things, of taking most allies by surprise. How do you assess Russia's capabilities and potential in Belarus?
And then if you could pass it on, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Alexander Daniluk from Ukraine. Thank you. Very interesting panel. I think that we need to be honest that actually deterrence and especially war fighting, it's kind of practical thing. It's not hypothetical, right? So like in terms of like that nice symbolic gesture of having some Western troops in Ukraine, if they're not ready to fight Russians, what's the point to have them? And in terms of deterring Russia from attacking Estonia, for instance, I believe that there is only one country which know how can and has a will, to fight Russians and to kill Russians. And I would recommend you to have one Ukrainian division in each of the Baltic countries. That would be much better. Troops on the ground to deter Russia, and also much cheaper. In terms of Air Force, I fully agree that this is actually what needs to be done. So Ukraine need to build that Air Force component also to support the 3 divisions, in Baltic countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we go along the panel quickly if you want to respond to any of those? Michael, do you want to start at that end and come?
Okay. Sure, since the questions were to me, I'm happy to answer Francois' comment. Francois, interesting. I think from a sustainability point of view, when I say things like, well, I don't mean it's on a timeline of 2025. I mean, if we look out further, at least a year or two. But the reality is that Russia does have material constraints as well. It also has economic constraints. And if you look at probably the most critical factor for Russia right now is ultimately, at the end of the day, the price of oil. And if the price of oil stays at a certain point for 6 months or more, it will create growing pressures. Plus, there's also simply the reality of the diminishing point of the war in terms of Russian ability to achieve their aims. But I take your point, and sustainability is very hard to predict, as we've seen in this war and other wars. Wars go on often long past the point when either side has good prospects to attain their aims or attain a decisive advantage, and they usually go on longer than we expect. That said, I am very much set in my views. But to your comment, James, so are we not overlooking, ignoring Belarus? Well, I mean, the first answer, the cheeky answer would be is that's a feature of a panel focused on Ukraine. But there's a good point. So I don't think that Russia has the forces in play to open up another front from Belarus. I simply don't see this. Then the reality is that even though Russia has, over the course of the last 3 years, engaged in force generation, they've increased the size of the force deployed each year. They're not only recruiting at a rate that allows replacement, they're also recruiting at a rate that allows them to generate additional forces and deploy additional forces into the field. And that's what enabled them to expand the front to Kharkiv last year. Nonetheless, still significant portions of that force are pinned across a very, very large front, right? Stretching all the way up from Bryansk, Kursk, all the way past Belgorod, and the 1,200-kilometer front line. And so there isn't this excess force capacity for a major operation from Belarus that I can see in the near future. And there were fears of that actually going back, if you recall, in winter of 2023. And part of the reason it didn't materialize is because Russian military, particularly Russian military intelligence, has worked very hard to try to create the fear that there might be this other front, this other offensive, in order to stretch and extend Ukrainian military and try to cover much more frontage than they necessarily have to. But the reality is that the force capacity simply isn't there. I think you're seeing, basically what you're seeing is most of what you're going to get.
Anyone else want to pick up on any other points?
I mean, I was just going to agree, but also foot stomp the first comments that Europeans' first priority and focus right now should be in replacing U.S. military assistance to Ukraine. I think, lamentably, the most likely outcome, given how far apart the two warring factions are on a ceasefire, is that this administration gets frustrated and moves on. We've already seen the president make that decision with Gaza. You know, he's convinced Netanyahu's set in his ways. He has his war aims. He's not going to convince him. And so they've largely moved on. And we've seen that in the most recent Middle East tour that really didn't involve Israel or Netanyahu. It's a very real possibility that this administration just changes its focus elsewhere. It's been mentioned already, but if the U.S. attention shifts elsewhere, it is highly unlikely that military assistance to Ukraine in its current form, or even in a lessened form, exists in the future. And so while I do think it's important that we're having conversations on ceasefires and negotiations and a future reassurance force, Ukraine continues to need immediate requirements and defenses now for pushing back against Russian aggression. So I think that needs to remain, for all these reasons, Europe's preeminent priority focus over for the foreseeable future.
Okay. Yeah, I would add also a few remarks that the question about replacing the states as a military backstop or like a military backbone in Europe, it's very acute. I would say that everybody is contemplating on it, but all the contemplators say that you can replace probably money-wise, but not the weaponry and capabilities-wise somewhat soon. So I would say, to be honest, we should not be naive. This transatlantic connection needs to be strong, and I would say that right now, I know that a lot of people are skeptic about it, but I would say that shifts in also the state's administration, also in messaging, in Truth Social or whatever this is, they have been going to that direction, that Europe and states are allies in certain things also, which was not there, let's say, 2 months ago or 3 months ago. So the direction is probably better than it used to be, but the skepticism is understandable. That is the first one. Money-wise and, let's say, democracy-wise and different operation-wise, probably Europe can replace almost everything, but not military capability-wise. I would say that not anytime soon, to be honest. So, and also, to be honest, what kind of world we want? We would like to have the states also as our partner in democracy, value-based world, rule-based world, not the other way around. Who will be the partners if not the states in Europe? Second one was that is Belarus independent player or should some kind of attacks be? I agree that there's no signs of it right now, but should also, everybody in this room and knows that Belarus is not an independent decider, not for a long time. The question was that will they even be a state with their own name for a longer period of time? Right now they are somewhat state, but they are not independent state or independent player. They are managed by Russia, so that is quite obvious. Everybody knows that. So if something happens, that happens only with Russia's objectives or plans. This is not a separate event that will happen. So it pretty much depends everything that if the state and European pressure continues on Russia, what will happen with sanctions, with cutting off the funds and everything, so on. So, and yeah, the third remark from Ukraine that yeah, let's keep it that way. That first we will send our help to you, and when there's just a lasting peace, you will come to us.
Thank you. Unless, no. I had a question here from a lady in the middle, and then one over there and one over there.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Olga Oliker from the International Crisis Group. I think my question's mainly to Mike, but I think I'd be interested if other people have views on this. So bad animal metaphors aside, I think this question of what does Ukraine's armed forces look like should we get to a peace, and what do they need and how big it should be is a pretty important one, because you know, if we're talking about them deploying units across Europe, that's a pretty big force that's able to do that. If we're talking about them maintaining deterrence at home, and that's the purpose, it's also a pretty big force, but probably smaller than the one they've got now. So I just want to put that out there because, you know, what does the animal of choice made of steel look like?
Thank you. I had, yeah, 2 questions, one over there and then one at the front.
Hello, my name is Kateřina Šafaříková. I'm a journalist from Prague. One of the panelists yesterday, I think it was Sergei Medvedev, the professor, said that there's not such a thing as post-war time or post-war period, and that the war is going to be with us for a very, very long time. And why? Because the Russian society, not only the FSB elite and the military, but also the society as such, has accepted the war as the new normal, or even as a glue of the society that keeps them together. And if you agree with this, then one has to realize that we have to change our plans against it. There is no such a thing as ceasefire post-war period, but that's going to be the war for at least decades. And I wanted to ask maybe Michal, Georgina, what do you think of this, if you agree with this? Thank you.
And I have one question here at the front, and then we'll hear from the panelists.
Yes, hello, good morning. Bob Dane from the Netherlands. I'm going to abuse a little bit of Dutch bluntness and correctness, because I very much love being at the Lennart Meri conference, but I have the impression it's not slightly representative for the mood across Western and Southern Europe. Let's put it like that. I'm one of those who had to answer questions when asked in a briefing by Parliament about why are we doing this boots on the ground thing? Because if we were willing to fight alongside Ukrainians against Russians, why aren't we there already? And I'm still stuck on this question. I'm under the impression the primary reason that Europeans are willing to talk about boots on the ground is because the Americans asked them, are you willing to back up our deal if we negotiate them? And I think ever since Europeans have been trying to pretend very credibly that they're willing to go into Ukraine and force a deal, but in reality this was never meant to be peacekeeping. And Mike, we've had this discussion on deterrence. I don't think it's ever meant to be deterrence either, because otherwise we wouldn't wait for a deal. We would have been there already. So I'm trying to get to a point where I can sit if next time Parliament asks me what is really feasible. And I had this idea that air power, and Mike, you mentioned it, is much more feasible than a very small military deployment. And with François here, it might only look humiliating if all that Europe can come up with is 20,000 troops shaking of fear west of Dnipro. Please, Putin, don't attack them. Aren't we better off putting some strong air assets in the game that could actually credibly be used? Thank you.
Okay. Interesting questions. Right, let's go for the panel for these, and we'll relatively brief answers. Who'd like to start? Torrey, do you want to go first? Do you have any?
Let's see. I mean, just to answer your last comment, I agree. I think air capabilities and what Michael was saying earlier makes more sense than a 20,000 person troop formation. It kind of gets back to what we were discussing earlier with what does a credible formation in Ukraine look like? And I just don't see a 20,000 force west of the Dnipro being a credible way to reassure Ukraine. I think capabilities in air defense, which is what Ukraine's been asking for since the beginning of the war, is the best way to reassure moving forward. I also don't necessarily disagree that one of the reasons there has been this flurry of British and French diplomatic activity is because the U.S. has said, Europe, Ukraine's future is for you to decide. I think it is important that these conversations are happening in Europe. I think what the French and the Brits are doing is a good sign of European leadership. But I don't know if 20,000 troops in Western Ukraine is the best way to show European leadership for Ukraine's future.
Georgina?
I'm still thinking about the question about, how Russians have integrated it and how what would Putin need to sell basically a so-called ceasefire. I don't think I have the answers, but I'm going to think about it. On the last point, because these are discussions that are happening in London and in Paris as well, right? Which is, and again, it comes back to how you sell it, like why the inconsistencies with your positions before, how this is different. I think the language around we went from peacekeeping force to a reassurance force to, as what I said, a buffer zone to further support deterrence, like we are slowly shifting what it means. I think we shouldn't forget that these coalition of the willing talks aren't happening in isolation. I mean, Ukraine is involved, like Keir Starmer, President Macron, they ring Zelensky. These are ongoing conversations. And as I said at the beginning, I think the fact that there is not enough detail out there is strategic. It is on purpose. It's not just because we don't have the answers. It's because we're testing different viable options. And that brings me on the air defense point, because you hear it more and more now as, is that a more credible way to ensure deterrence if that's what we're looking for? But again, can you do that without the Americans in the short to medium term, and then we go back full circle. So I think Europe has to, we have to have some detail about this coalition of the willing soon, because otherwise no one's going to believe in it, least of all the Russians. But I think all the questions that have been posed to date throughout the conference are things that are front and mind of centre of policymakers, and that's mildly reassuring.
Michael?
Sure. I don't agree, and I'm going to tell you why. So first, a force to fight Russia in this war is very different from a deterrence force to deter a future war. But a big part of what this force has to do is assure Ukraine, an assurance component to it. So if you have air power alone, there are a couple of challenges. First, what is it there to do? If there is a ceasefire and there are no longer Russian strikes in Ukraine, what are you actually doing? Just flying around? Okay. I know European Air Force is very good at this, but what is it actually going to be doing? Yeah, it's like Baltic airplanes. Great, yeah, you guys know how to do this. Okay, yeah, fantastic. How is this going to assure Ukraine? Ukraine has an Air Force. It has Western aircraft in the Air Force now. In terms of air defense, Ukraine can handle Western air defense and performs phenomenally with it. The problem is we haven't provided enough batteries. We don't need Western air defense manned by Western air defense operators in Ukraine. It actually would be much easier to transfer the capabilities to them. Okay. Second, actually doing air power at scale is a lot harder in practice than looks on paper, and I don't know why European folks think they'll have an easier job doing that without American support rather than a ground force. Actually, it might be quite harder for any scale deployment, and it's going to be quite expensive. And it will require integration with Ukrainian air defense, Ukrainian air power. In a combat environment, it's actually going to be a lot technically harder at first than it looks. It's all manageable, but I'm just saying it's if you think it's much easier than some smaller ground force component deployment, it's not. Next, what is it tying into? If you have a ground force component, then you very clearly have something that connects to your air power, where you have your own folks that are able to then tactically integrate them, right, in the field. All right. If we're talking about why the ground force component is to some extent significant, in the event of, let's say, a renewed conflict, a collapse of the ceasefire, the easiest thing for the NATO air mission to do is to just stop flying, okay? Because it's operating from NATO territory, right? So how much assurance does this really provide, okay? So I'm sorry, it's just too easy to switch off, okay? Yes, at the very least, it should be a mixture of the two, I think. Right? And I think that from a practical approach, it's the kind of thing that briefs well, but when you try to walk it off of PowerPoint into what it's really going to be, I think it's going to be far less effective. And I've been in this too long, and I've seen too many things that brief really well, but are not going to be doing. I mean, if you're going to do that, you might just as well also have just a Western training component in VIV, you know, as a component force, because it'll be just as easy to switch off and pull out. And last, like I said, there are baked-in assumptions that this would be easy or less expensive to do. In reality, both proposals, or a combination of the two, will involve trade-offs our current NATO regional defense plans and commitments. They are choices. Strategy is about choices. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. So whatever you choose to do, it will involve trade-offs.
Yep.
Okay? And the third trade-off that Torrey mentioned, that we don't know, or at least European colleagues don't know, what potential reductions or drawdowns we might face in European theater from the United States if EUCOM has to absorb significant budget cuts this year, and then in the follow-on year, potentially, too.
One thing, I know we're out of time, one thing we haven't really discussed today is what the rules of engagement of such a force would be. And I think that features tremendously into what the credibility of such a force would look like. I don't have the answer to that, but I think that's important for Europeans to work out with Russians, either via US negotiators or whatnot, but that affects the credibility as well.
Yeah. Prime Minister, last word?
Yep. Many things have been said, and I agree with Michael that it's probably military boots or troops on the ground. It's commitment, backing up the commitment after some kind of political agreement. It's a message, and also in great books wrote by authors of our time, Harry Potter, there's a saying that you make an unbreakable commitment. That is the idea. But only after you have this kind of peace, not before. Because, as pointed out, it's quite obvious that Ukraine's army is quite capable. The innovation level there, capabilities to stop Russians or fight with them are much higher than everybody can imagine right now. So the first thing is to back up Ukraine as much as possible and achieve just and lasting peace, and after that to make a commitment also with the future. As we said, that with European future depends on the peace in Ukraine. So that means also that we will make some commitments. That's quite obvious. And as pointed out, nothing with this kind of commitments will be easy. Nothing will be cheap. This kind of commitment will be lasting, as pointed out also with the question that this war and this peace, how it plays out, will be with us in decades to come. That will deter Russia, or it will increase Russia's capabilities and the abilities to regroup and take on different hybrid operations or war. So I would say that this kind of commitment yes, should be unbreakable, that everybody understands that we are committed to that. Ukraine will be part of the European Union, and we will treat them as brothers in the European Union, nothing else.
I'm sorry to those who had more questions, but we have run out of time. We've had a fascinating discussion. I'm not sure we've resolved whether a steel porcupine is indeed the right animal, but you can go and discuss that over a coffee break. But before that, please do thank our excellent panel for their contributions.